Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I'm Matty K. Stormageddon.
And you're listening to episode 159. And this episode, we are talking about that web-headed menace of the city, that scourge of the bugle. We're talking about Spider-Man and the history he's had in video games. And to join us and help us in that retrospective and conversation, from Game Informer, we have Marcus Stewart. Mr. Stewart, thank you for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
It's funny, I knew Marcus was a big Spider-Man fan, but when Marcus very recently went to bat for the Neversoft Spider-Man game and is actually doing a replay of it over on Game Informer's YouTube channel, I was like, oh no, Marcus is definitely coming on the podcast, because that people forget about that game all the time, and I'm like, oh, Marcus is one of us. He understands.
Yes, justice for Neversoft Spider-Man.
Absolutely. I think most folks only remember that exists because Spider-Man was in Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2. And how did they get that? Because they also made the Spider-Man game. Oh.
Yeah, and they paid it forward because they put a lot of Tony Hawk ads in that game that I didn't remember until replaying. I was like, man, they really put Tony Hawk stuff all over the place in this game.
It has been an age since I've played that game. I don't have a ton of memories, but I know I played it. I got to go back.
Yeah. It's like in the subway, you see straight up just the logo plastered on walls, and it just repeats over and over as you're riding the subway train. It's like, hey, subliminal, Tony Hawk 2, you should probably go buy that.
You know what? There's been plenty of games advertised within games that, if it was like Daikatana, I think we'd all feel real bad about it, but it was Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2. I think we're all vindicated.
Yeah, it worked out, it turns out.
Worked out, yeah.
Yeah.
So before we get into the broader conversation about Spider-Man and video games, in which he's been in very many video games, actually a lot more than even I realized, I think the best place to start, as we do with these retrospectives, is our first experience with Spider-Man, specifically in video games. I think I'm going to guess that for most of us, it's either the comics or the Fox cartoon is where we first encountered Spider-Man, because we're all of that age. But for video games, it's kind of like a broad gambit. He was in a ton of stuff in the early days. But to start the conversation, and I shared a video of this with you guys in our DMs, the first game I ever played with Spider-Man, and it was actually one that was never released on console. It was an arcade game called Spider-Man the Video Game. It was made by Sega, and you could play as Spider-Man, Hawkeye, Namor, or Black Cat.
What a lineup.
Right?
The lineup
so
is
random.
bizarre, and the story is so strange. It's so bizarre, and it's interesting because it was one of the few arcades to play with size and scale. At one point, Venom gets this magic tablet that makes him grow. So then the camera zooms out, and you're a small Spider-Man trying to chase down this giant Venom.
It's Sega playing with the super scaler technology that they had, I guess.
Yeah,
Blast processing, baby.
Yu Suzuki didn't toil in the 80s for nothing, kids.
And I can't remember what arcade I played this in first, but it was definitely probably a local one in New York and New Jersey. And I just remember being infatuated with it and playing as Spider-Man, and it was a beat 'em up, which they'll come back to later in the Super Nintendo Genesis era. But it's so funny to me that all of the early experiences probably with Spider-Man are more beat 'em up related, which would be so far from what the genre of Spider-Man would be considered now. But I loved this arcade. I remember beating it. I'm sure if I played it now, it would only take 45 minutes. We've talked about this before, but arcades when we were kids felt so much longer when you're feeding them quarters than they do now when you can get infinite lives if there's a ROM or whatever. But I remember loving this game and dumping a ton of money into it.
I found it so funny watching the video because I'd never seen that in the wild, Matt. And there was something about it that was bugging me. I realized it was the fact that there was so little dynamicism in Spider-Man's pose, in his gait, in his walk. All of his punching animations, his feet didn't move, and it was just an average, I'm awkwardly at an audition kind of stance. I was reading a YouTube comment that nailed it. It was, why does Spider-Man walk like he got 3 kids and a mortgage? And it was just the slumped shoulders and everything. And it was just, that's it. And it all just kind of came together. And there were 1 or 2 moves he did, but it also was vibrant. It was beautiful. It was 1992 when it came out? It had the comic book visuals. And so why not? I say this from my lofty position of 30 years later and so much more development, but yeah, it's colorful as hell, man.
I haven't seen this game either until I watched the same video that Matt sent, and I was just chuckling the whole time. Like you said, it looks colorful and looks nice, but just some of the weirdness around it, especially Venom, was interesting because a character, he was not that old. Like, it had not been that long since he had debuted in the comics. It was kind
First
of
decade for him, yeah.
yeah. They're like, oh man, first boss is Venom. Like that would never happen today, almost. And also just his weird cry in the game, where like maybe that was the first time you ever heard Venom speak, because this is pre-animated series, but he just sounded like a weird like. Kind of like hillbilly tripping out. Like when you beat him, he's like, and you're like, oh, I was like, what is he saying words? Like he is like Eddie Brock is like losing his mind right now, I guess. And just other weird little things like that. Like when Scorpion shows up and his tail is like weirdly limp and he's doing this very odd spinning motion with it that is like less threatening and then like more erotic perhaps. Just some weird stuff in there. And again, I noticed the Spider-Man walk too of like, man, my man Peter's tired. Man.
He's tired.
This is Peter B. Parker in the game. You know, he's over it.
His first appearance.
Yeah, exactly. He's just like, man, let's just go. Let's just get this over with.
How sinister are this 6?
Once I knew I was going to be sharing it as my starting point for Spider-Man, which of course I've played many other games since, I had to share it because I realized, oh man, I'm of an age, I'm just older enough, I think, that this is still a generation before, because more people should know about this arcade game. And if you've not seen it, please look up A Long Play on YouTube, because it really is. The weirdness we've covered isn't even the half of it, really. Well, Geoff, what about you? What is your earliest experience with Spider-Man in video games?
So, Matt, everything you said there is wonderful. Mine goes even older.
Oh,
and
really?
It's a game that nobody should play. Or maybe they should. My first experience with Spider-Man in video games, there was, I don't know if it was an Apple II or just an old, somewhere around that stage of Apple computer in my elementary school classroom, where you would load the programs on the actual 5.5-inch floppy disk with the hole in the middle, all that stuff. Programs wouldn't run if you weren't loading from disk. And I now know what the series was and everything else with the benefit of hindsight and Wikipedia. Quest Probe Spider-Man. Quest Probe was a series of text adventure games that several of them were based around comic book characters, and I believe the second one was Spider-Man. Now, I was, as mentioned, in elementary school at the time, and this was probably my first text adventure game, like true text adventure game. I grew up on things like Shadowgate and the MacVenture series on my NES, but those you could point and click, there was a graphic interface, whatever else. This started off in an office building where the exits were north, south, east, and west. Drab office building with shoddy, threadbare carpet, I believe was the exact quote of how it's described. And I don't know anybody in my 4th grade class who was able to get Spider-Man to do a fucking thing. Everything we asked, everything we typed was met with, I don't know how to, whatever you asked, something. Like, walk, I don't know how to walk something. Learn, I don't know how to learn something. Die, I don't know how to die something. Grrr! About the whole thing. And so nobody got it anywhere. Nobody made Spider-Man do anything. Spider-Man bested us. We were the villains. Haha. And I now know more about text parsers and would love to go back to it and just for my own edification conquer it. But my first time with Spider-Man in video games, it was first person. The only Spider-Man I saw in the game was at the title screen. It wasn't as if I got any further and would see Spider-Man. I saw the Spider-Man I could, and he foiled me through trolling in action. That is my first experience with Spider-Man in video games. Thankfully, it's been uphill from there.
That's
amazing. First person, it's like you got to wear the mask.
I got to be Spider-Man.
Like they said in Spider-Verse, like anyone can wear the mask. That's what they were trying to make you feel.
Anyone could. It's all up to me.
Yes. To make him walk, and apparently that is a lot to ask of.
I looked up, like in prep for this episode, I watched a playthrough of that game, and the first thing somebody did was go upside down, and it flipped the viewpoint upside down, and I'm like, I was robbed. This is incredible. Like, not even ironic. That's, God damn it, man. Loved it.
Amazing.
Pro gaming.
Well, what about you, Marcus? What was your first experience with Spider-Man in video games?
The earliest that I can remember was a game called Venom Spider-Man Separation Anxiety.
Oh,
for the Sega
yeah.
Genesis.
Mm-hmm.
It was a 2-player beat 'em up that me and my younger brother loved because like that was our thing. Being brothers, like beat 'em ups were like our bread and butter. We played so many of like the classic ones at the time.
Yeah.
And loving Spider-Man, it was like, oh, this is perfect. And I just remember I always, because you could play a Spider-Man and Venom, you're fighting Carnage as well as the other symbiote spawn like Scream and I rarely ever remember the rest of those other symbiotes.
There was
like,
the doppelganger that had the fangs and the extra arms. There
well, that's Spider-Man. Like, he's technically not... Well, he was in the game too, wasn't he?
Yeah, because that was one that, like,
in it?
Carnage and Shriek made. Because there was the Spider-Man that grew the extra arms, and then this one was, like, a whole other... Yeah, I'm trying to remember all the stuff from Separation Anxiety that I mostly remember from Overpower cards.
Right. I guess it was pretty much... It was a sequel to Maximum Carnage, the game, which was based on the comic series. I actually did it backwards, where I played Maximum Carnage after this, not knowing that they were a sequel or anything like that. But again, as a beat 'em up, which I love, it was like, oh my God, Spider-Man, and my brother has to be Venom, because I was like, no, it's weird, because like you would think Venom's technically better. It was like, no, I'm the hero, I'm Spider-Man, I have to always be Spider-Man. There's no debate, I'm the older brother, and so I got my way. But it was fun, like just seeing like the other symbiotes and the characters and just running around and beating stuff. And I just remember having so much fun shooting webs at people and how colorful it looked. I have never revisited it, so I have no idea how it holds up. I also remember you could come summon like other heroes as like assist, basically. Like I remember Ghost Rider, Captain America. I remember there were a couple more. I think Daredevil was in it.
That sounds about right.
Maybe one or two more, but it was cool to just see them. Just again, it's like, oh my God, hey, that other guy. But yeah, it was like another game like the arcade Spider-Man game. You could probably beat it in like under an hour, probably. But it took us forever because we're kids and we're like, you play a little bit and then you lose, and you play a little bit and get a little bit further, and then you lose and have to start all the way over, or you got to go to church and you got to stop playing it, and you can't trick your mom into letting you leave the TV and the console on as you plead with her to understand the severity of the situation.
You don't understand. I'll have to start from the beginning.
I got to save the city,
it's
Mom.
Like, the final boss. Like, you don't understand. Like, just please.
Kids today won't know our pain of leaving our consoles on because there was no saving the game.
It's like, how much electricity can it really use? Come on.
As somebody with way too many consoles plugged into outlets now, more than I'd like to admit.
So yeah, that was my first. Love that game.
It's a good one. Yeah, I like that game a lot too. We would have been a good pair, Marcus, because I, of course, would have preferred Venom. I am a known Venom sicko on this podcast and in other places. But yeah, I loved that. I had started with Maximum Carnage and really loved that game. Although it was unreasonably difficult, I probably used Game Genie often on both of those games. But something about the beat-em-up style just seemed to work with Spider-Man. I mean, he does a lot of punching in the comics also, so I guess it makes sense. I remember the web swinging in both of those games being incredibly awful, though. Like, trying to climb buildings, and like there'd always be one stage where you're like climbing a building and a villain's shooting down at you. I think it was like Electro in the first game, and like avoiding the blasts, you'd fall and die, which would never happen to Spider-Man because A, you have the spider sense, and B, like you can web swing. When would you ever fall to your death as Spider-Man?
Yeah, head cannon, like, oh, he must have ran out of cartridges.
Right, exactly.
I think there was a game where you had a limited amount of web fluid and you had to make money to buy more by taking pictures.
Yes, that was actually Spider-Man versus Kingpin, which was a Genesis game, and another early Spider-Man game that I played. You would do these like beat-em-up stages. I don't even think you could punch, but you mostly webbed enemies. And as you're going through the mission, you could select from like a menu your camera, and it would take a photo of the scene, and then you would get money at the end of every stage for the photos you've taken.
That's pretty cool.
It's a bizarre way to work in the photography mechanic, but I remember it being a big part of it. I was watching a Let's Play of it the other day, and like I never saw the Kingpin fight. Like I fast forwarded to see what the Kingpin fight was like. I was like, this does not look familiar at all. I definitely never got to this.
You're too busy making money. Like, this game is Spider-Man versus poverty for me.
I mean, that's life. Spider-Man prepared us for the gig economy, unfortunately.
Right. I feel like Spider-Man, while there were tons of games in the Super Nintendo and Genesis era, I feel like it wasn't until the PlayStation and then especially the PS2 and like GameCube, Xbox era that Spider-Man games really kind of took on a life of their own. I mean, infamously, Spider-Man and the X-Men Arcade's Revenge will haunt our nightmares forever as like, there are people who defend that game as a great game, and I don't know what game they were playing.
I know I played it. My memory is fuzzy. I probably liked it because I love Spider-Man and X-Men, so there was no debate.
Yeah, as far as sibling stuff goes, Spider-Man was my older brother's thing. X-Men was mine. So there was a lot of Spider-Man games and Spider-Man things that I might have played as a kid that very briefly or at someone else's house. I went for X-Men games. There were 3 X-Men games on the Game Gear, and I loved those games. And Spider-Man vs. the Kingpin actually had a Game Gear release that I only recently got a copy of, so I'll let you know later how it is. But I do, before we get into 3D, because I think you're absolutely right, and I do want to talk about this, it's very interesting. I don't know about y'all, but Spider-Man feels like more Sega than Nintendo, and looking back on the listing of games, there were plenty of Super Nintendo releases, and certainly ones that were on both. Maybe it was like the 90s comic book feel. This was the console that gave us X-Men games, gave us Comic Zone. And also the fact that Spider-Man vs. Kingpin's a fun one where I want to drop the fun fact here. Spider-Man closed out 2 different Sega consoles. Spider-Man vs. the Kingpin was one of the last titles released for the Sega Master System in North America. I don't know if it was the very last one. This is just Wikipedia. But Spider-Man and the Web of Fire was the last North American release for the 32X, which was largely a North American creation anyway.
I will say that as someone who owned a 32X, and one of the 3 games I owned for it was The Amazing Spider-Man Web of Fire. It was not a good game. It was fine. Graphically, it was impressive. It was like that pseudo 3D kind of almost claymation-y kind of look to it. It had depth. But it was another side-scrolling, you're shooting webs, you're punching things. And I don't even remember it being that memorable. I mean, we started by talking about separation anxiety with Marcus, and I spent a lot of time playing both of those games. I think I had them on the Genesis, but they were, I felt like, defining titles at the time. And I don't know if they're one of the best Spider-Man games ever made, but they were definitely some of the best games for those consoles at the time. They were fun. They had a lot of characters in them. The second one was multiplayer. There's more diversity, I think, in Spider-Man games in the 3D era, whereas in the 2D era, it was mostly beat-em-ups, mostly with guest stars to fill out the roster, and similar kinds of mechanics. But I don't think any of them were particularly awful from what I can remember, except Spider-Man and the X-Men and Arcade's Revenge. That one was just bad.
I mean, Web of Fire was better than Cosmic Carnage, which is a game that has nothing to do with Spider-Man, but was the 32X game that I was certain had to do with Maximum Carnage, and was sorely disappointed, and then the game was terrible. So,
it was a bad game.
Was,
I think all of the 32X games were pretty bad now that I think about it, except for Virtua Fighter, which was kind of okay because it was just Virtua Fighter.
Star Wars Arcade played pretty well on that thing. And I'm not going to defend Doom, but I certainly played it.
Well, sure. But yeah, I mean, I think the thing is that's more interesting, I think, about the 3D games is the 2D games, there's not a lot of diversity to talk about, right? I feel like they all kind of had the same feel. And it wasn't until we got to PlayStation and the aforementioned Neversoft Spider-Man game where we're getting voice acting for the first time in a Spider-Man game. We're getting cutscenes. We're getting narrative in a way that the older games did. Maximum Carnage had the comic book panel stuff. This is true, the introduction to 3D cutscenes. And I feel like it was interesting the way the web slinging worked and the combat worked. It was the first time we really got to feel more dynamically like Spider-Man, I feel like.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I feel Spider-Man was very much meant for 3D design. Between web slinging working on far more than just side-scrolling buildings and areas, hyperextension and flexibility of limbs allowing for polygon-based movement would look weird on a human, but Spider-Man, it makes perfect sense. The physics-based traversal of web slinging. I mean, web slinging proves the idea of Miyamoto and Mario that sometimes just how you move around the space can be the foundation of fun, and then you make a great game around that. Before Insomniac Spider-Man came out, Spider-Man 2 for the PS2 and other systems as well was held up as an utter bastion of great movement, of great traversal. So many people played that game just to web sling around. And then there was a really good game attached to it.
Not to skip over PlayStation, but you're right. I think the movement is important to Spider-Man.
And the voice acting.
And the voice acting, sure. I mean, I have some kind of fun trivia from when we get to the Xbox 360, PlayStation 3 era Spider-Man games by Beanox, because their voice casting for those games was inspired based on nostalgia for previous Spider-Man voice actors, which I think is really brilliant. But I feel like I really dug in with Spider-Man with the Neversoft game. And then, like you said, Spider-Man 2 was the first time we're like, oh, you can make a giant world where you can be Spider-Man. I mean, I have to imagine that Spider-Man 2 for PS2 and Xbox, and I think that was on GameCube also. I think it was for all three.
I think so.
It must have been an inspiration for Insomniac. I mean, there's just too much there to not say that there isn't.
Yeah, if you go back to the Neversoft game, as I'm doing now, it's kind of wild to see, even back then, some of the foundations of like modern web swinging. Like even swinging is still tied to the right trigger, which, you know, that's the go button pretty much for every Spider-Man game now for swinging. So even just that part of like initiating, you're like, oh my God, like, yeah, we're still doing this. Okay. And just the like spider sense, you know, like this is pre-counter stuff, but the idea of like integrating that to, again, warn you of like what's ahead instead of doing like an arrow or anything else. Like it's almost like a diegetic game design of like, no, it's on the character, this like indicator that something's ahead or something you need to look out for instead of just like pointing you like, go this way, idiot. You know, the game does have that little compass, but, you know, doesn't show up all the time. I mean, I have a whole thing with that Neversoft Spider-Man game. I love it so much. Like, that was my favorite PlayStation game of like all the classics that I love, like Metal Gear Solid, Symphony of the Night, Final Fantasy. Like, just because I was such, or I still am, but like such a huge Spider-Man fan. Like, I was still riding the high of the 90s animated series and maybe to a lesser extent Spider-Man Unlimited. And like for that to kind of be almost like a spiritual successor to those shows, with like say with the voice acting and the cinematics, like, oh, this is like another Spider-Man show because they're like, we're watching it. But to kind of check off so much of my wish list at that time of like what a great Spider-Man game would be, like I wore that thing out. Like I absolutely beat that game more than any other PlayStation 1 game I had. Like I played it with every costume on, and that would just be my like escape, you know, like if I was just in a mood to like feel cool basically in a video game, it's like I think I'm just gonna play this whole game again because this makes me feel like my favorite superhero. So.
And Spider-Man, more than any other superhero to me, is the ultimate video game superhero for adaptation. The powers that he has works for traversing a video game world. There are a lot of traversal-based stuff that just feel cool that people can't do. The amount of super strength, but not like godly super strength, means you feel good fighting street thugs, but also fighting up against other superpowered people. You can kind of scale that out. He's had enough different outfits and looks throughout the years that all still feel iconic, that you could have cool costumes, and we still have that to this day, as well as the fact that doing the classic costume means you only render the webs once and you don't have to draw them every panel. I don't know what they were thinking in Amazing Fantasy, but here we are. And colorful cast of characters, you could have it focused entirely around a single villain or tons of members of the Rogues Gallery. I mean, look, I'll put it down there. Batman wishes he had this good of a video game styled Rogues Gallery as far as things go. Like, now that I'm thinking about it, I'm looking at a couple of pictures now that we're talking about it. Yeah, the Neversoft Spider-Man for PS1, like, they were figuring out so many things about 3D and about everything else. I mean, it came out in 2000, but it was still PS1. Yeah, they got a lot right. And we've just been iterating from there.
I mean, the character, just because of his power set, it allowed you to explore 3D spaces in a way that no other video game character maybe lets you, or you would have to come up with, because he can crawl on walls. You're like, okay, well, what if players can go on ceilings, or they can crawl around things on a building instead of up and down? Like, replaying it now, it was wild. Like, there's like sequences when you got to swing on the rooftops and there's all these guys, and it's like you can fight them or you can just crawl around the building and avoid them entirely. And it's like, oh, like I never appreciated that you have that choice to just like completely circumvent them just using Spider-Man's abilities, which again leads into the role-playing fantasy of like, yeah, in my mind, it'd be like, oh, there's too many goons. I'm just gonna sneak past these guys because that's what Spider-Man would do because he's smart. There was no games that let you explore worlds that way. And it's just like, oh, because you have this character handed to you in a silver platter that is designed for that. And you almost don't have to do any balancing for him as a video game character because Marvel's writers have taken care of that. Like, he's, like I said, he's strong, but not too strong. He can take a lot of hits, but not too much. So you don't have the Superman problem, but you also don't have the Batman thing of like, well, he's a normal guy. How many hits can he really take when you think about it?
Yeah.
The webs, you can do whatever you want with those pretty much because he's a smart kid with gadgets. He's like, I don't think I've ever thought about it right now because I think Batman is a great character for video games. But yeah, like Spider-Man's kind of damn near perfect.
Well, I certainly remember Matt and I having conversations, and we weren't the only ones or the first ones to have it, where when Insomniac Spider-Man came out, it felt like an iteration on the Arkham games, but where it was so good for the soul to hear Kevin Conroy be Batman at all times, just narrating what he was doing. Having Spider-Man do it, Marvel Stan Lee thought bubble size of the page style felt exactly right. And again, to think of the PS1 era, one of my favorite PS1 games at the time was Gex. And I loved all the quips. Nowadays they're a little tiresome, but I still love the gameplay. And having those sort of things come out of Peter Parker, either reactions to things or thought process of what's going on or noticing something or, going through like thinking like a scientist and, working your way through the puzzle. It's its own sort of detective vision, but one that suits the medium and suits the character in a way that feels obvious in hindsight.
It's funny, I think two things that are key to Spider-Man in a way that I don't know are as key to other superhero games is also sound design. The sound that Spider-Man's web shooters make, you hear that sound. If you're a Spider-Man fan, like, you know what that sounds like. The quips, the dialogue. I mean, the thing I love about the Neversoft game, if you've never played it, you should go watch the replay on Game Informer shows on YouTube. But besides watching the replay, you should also just look up on YouTube a compilation of all of Venom's lines from that first game, because like I've always loved Venom. He's one of my favorite characters, but he's played so unhinged in that game in a way that he's never been played again. I would say that the Tom Hardy movies are approaching that level of absurdity. Like, those like old compilations of ridiculous things your kids say, like it's that, but Venom. Like he just says some of the most bizarre shit in that game, and I love it.
Yeah, he's pretty great in that game. And I remember even playing with Kyle for the replay, because he's not like a huge Spider-Man guy in terms of knowledge. And he was just kind of taken aback. He's like, Venom, he's so quippy. Is he always quippy like this? And I'm thinking like, well, yes, especially at this time, like 90s Venom, like Lethal Enforcer era. Like, yeah, kind of. And he was like, I think we've gotten away from that. I guess I have not seen the Venom movies, by the way, believe it or not.
They are campy in a way that I think is totally worth it.
They are like the Green Lantern movie, but everything that was a downside for Green Lantern is a boon for Venom, and I don't know why or how, but that's how I can put it.
Yeah, that's what I hear, is that they're pretty wacky. But I think beyond that, I think Venom in the 2000s and maybe 2010s, adaptations made him more serious, I guess, and like scary, which is cool. I mean, like Venom's a scary dude. Playing this game reminded me of like, no, this was the era where like, yeah, Venom was scary, but he was like a troll, honestly.
Yeah.
As close as Spider-Man would ever get to a Bizarro.
Yeah, effectively, yeah. I mean, well, it's funny, and like even in the games as we went on, I don't believe he's in Spider-Man 2, but he is in one of my favorite PS2 games ever made, although it was multi-platform at the time, which is Ultimate Spider-Man, which was based on like I think the first 100 issues, maybe less, of the comics, but it's based on the early arc of Peter Parker and Eddie Brock, their friendship, and like how Venom comes to exist, which is a little different from the original Amazing Spider-Man. And I loved those comics. I had the omnibus of that. And when this game came out, I was like, oh, I get to play as Venom. And like what they did to do the duality of Spider-Man and Venom and how playing them was different. And even Venom earning the ability to web swing was part of the narrative, which is interesting to me because it is also in the comics. Is like the interesting thing about Venom in that is Venom exists first in Ultimate Spider-Man. Eddie Brock gets the suit first, before Spider-Man. Whereas in all the other media, Spider-Man gets it first, and then the symbiote wants to kill Spider-Man because Spider-Man rejected it. I just think it's such an interesting turn on it, and it pretty much took the web swinging from Spider-Man 2, made it better, and then also let you play as Venom and literally eat people as Venom, which is like from the comics. A lot of people are shocked these days to see Venom like eat people, but that's always been the narrative. He was effectively a zombie. He needed to eat other humans or brains to survive. And I love that now with the movie and the new game and other stuff, without spoiling late game stuff in the new game, but like those go back to that kind of Venom, the more serious Venom, I think, but also just the bizarreness of how that character exists. And I love that we've come back to that. That whole era of games, like we really got tons of really great stuff. Even Spider-Man 3 wasn't bad. And then we got the run of Beanox games. I don't think they did Web of Shadows, but they did Shattered Dimensions, Edge of Time, The Amazing Spider-Man.
Yeah. They did The Amazing Spider-Man 2.
Yes. All of those games were great, but I want to bring up before we jump around a little more, Shattered Dimensions. So in Shattered Dimensions, it was like, this is the first Spider-Verse game, because this is you play as Noir Spider-Man, Spider-Man 2099, Amazing Spider-Man, and Ultimate Spider-Man. And the voice actors cast for it. So the Ultimate Spider-Man voice actor reprised his role as Ultimate Spider-Man in this game. Amazing Spider-Man, the regular Spider-Man, was Neil Patrick Harris, who was also the MTV animated series Spider-Man.
Yep.
Noir Spider-Man was played by the 90s Spider-Man voice actor, whose name escapes me.
Chris Barnes.
And then the best part was that Spider-Man 2099 was played by the 70s, 80s original Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends Spider-Man voice actor. And like, to most people, who cares? But as a voice actor nerd, like I've always been, being such a Spider-Man nerd and then having all of those voice actors in the same game together, I was like, it doesn't get better than this. And that's true because Shattered Dimensions was way worse. But like that first game was really great. Also, like I've always been a huge fan of Neil Patrick Harris for a long time. And so like I loved that MTV cartoon. It was not great, but I loved it.
They made a lot of fun tries in that, and everyone did their best.
A season 2 had potential.
Yeah.
Like, I remember being iffy on a time, but it ended on a strong note. And I was like, okay, like there's a foundation here. I can't wait for season 2. And then
If I had to pick a Spider-Man series to continue, of course, Spectacular Spider-Man.
Sure.
But that's not a knock on that one.
Yeah.
yeah.
But like to have that kind of like forethought, right? It's like why I love a lot of the Arrowverse TV shows, even if I fell off a lot of them, was because they like paid nods with casting to previous media in DC. Like Dean Cain, though he's an asshole, was playing Kara's dad in one of the shows, and like they pay homage to what came before. And like the Beanox games did that as well, both with casting and with like the voice actors and the design and everything else. And I love that. I feel like Spider-Man games get geekier in a way that not all other comic book games get.
And again, that suits the character because it's Spider-Man. And no matter who's wearing the mask, Spider-Man's a nerd.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm glad we're talking about Shattered Dimensions because I feel like the game gets swept under the rug a lot. Because I remember that game is like fun. Like it is an underrated Spider-Man game. And it was also kind of like a nice maybe break because like Spider-Man games, because of the success of Spider-Man 2, they'd all kind of adopted that open world swinging formula, which is fun. But then that took it back to like, no, this is like a more linear kind of brawler. But like each Spider-Man has their own kind of gameplay style and setting because of, you know, representing their home dimensions. And I kind of enjoyed that sort of like almost like step backwards because then it reminded me of my childhood growing up with like the Spider-Man beat 'em ups, but like a more advanced version of it. And also how comic booky it got with like Amazing Spider-Man's web attacks just being so over the top and like almost like implausible of like, how is he's like shooting a web, but it's like turning into this cartoonishly sized like giant ball that he's like hitting 5 dudes with. It's just I like that they leaned into that stuff. So yeah, shout out to that game. Worth a look if people haven't played it.
Oh yeah, and wasn't that one of the inspirations for sort of the Spider-Verse ideas? Did this come before Spider-Verse comics?
I mean, if we're really gonna go back, that 90s animated show, that was my first Spider-Verse, was that like last arc in the series.
Oh right.
That was a good ways before that, and with Spider Carnage and all that stuff. But it was definitely before the Spider-Verse event, because Miles Morales was a part of that, and this would have been a year before Miles debuted, because Miles was 2011 when he came around.
Yes, in the Ultimate series, that's right.
Yeah. I mean, what's interesting here also is like Shattered Dimensions, you're right, went to more of a linear formula, which I thought was refreshing after getting kind of bored, and also Web of Shadows being a notorious flop. So the funny thing about Web of Shadows is I was excited for it because it was like, what if Venom was an alien invasion, right? And you got to use the black suit again, but you had to have the moral choice of being the black suit Spider-Man and being evil, or being the regular Spider-Man and ignoring the black suit and being the good guy. And the choices were dumb, and it was very black and white. Like, the thing I remember about it is when you would fight bosses, you would have these trigger moments where you could do the Black Spider-Man thing or just be regular Peter, and like you would make that choice at the end of the boss fight. You fought a lot of Marvel heroes who were consumed by the symbiote, and one of those battles was against Wolverine, voiced by, even back then, Stephen Bloom.
Oh yeah.
Honestly, they haven't announced the casting yet, but if Stephen Bloom isn't Wolverine in the Insomniac game, I'm going to be very upset. Like, they don't owe him anything. He's been doing it literally forever. But like,
that man has done very well. It's fine, but it would also feel really nice to hear it again.
Yeah, it'd be the Kevin Conroy as Batman in the Arkham game.
Pretty
much.
much.
That warm blanket.
Right.
Yes.
Exactly. But I remember fighting the symbiote Wolverine. At the end of the fight, you could either do the normal Spider-Man thing of getting the symbiote off him or the black suit Spider-Man thing of ripping him in half. And like you rip Wolverine in half, and then he like the symbiote goes away and he yells at you and he curses you out while like looking at his legs because it's Wolverine and he can heal. And I just like, what is this game? This doesn't make any sense.
Those are people who pay attention.
That game's, I've never played it, but I've watched cutscenes from it because I remember hearing how like wild that game is. So I've seen like the different endings and stuff, and I've seen that Wolverine cutscene, and just like again having the same thing. I'm like, oh my god, like they just went for it. Okay,
and it's very funny given how strongly moral choices have made their way into most genres of video games these days. That we haven't seen that come home to roost nearly as much for Mr. With Great Power Comes Great Responsibility.
Yeah, the choices seem to be more narrative for Spider-Man. Well, I think because also ultimately the reason Web of Shadows doesn't work is because Spider-Man is the everyman. And the minute you make him darker than that or more than that, like I think Insomniac Spider-Man 2 deals with darker themes better than I think the older games, because at the core, Peter is still Peter, Miles is still Miles, right? There's still those dorks who want to do good, even ultimately when things go wrong, in a way that like Web of Shadows was like, no, you've become fully evil as Spider-Man, and here's an ending that suits it, which is the most famous cutscene from this game is like the opening to the game shows like planes crashing and symbiotes killing people and Spider-Man like walking with his head hanging down and like off a building.
It's kind of a meme for a while.
It was such a meme. And like Spider-Man fails greatest when you don't consider the character or you don't consider the mechanics, because I think ultimately Spider-Man is the everyman that you can relate to. And the moment you try and take that away or make that less important, you lose some of who the character is. I thought the Amazing Spider-Man movies, for all their flaws, were pretty decent depictions of Peter Parker and Spider-Man. They weren't great, but I thought they were fine. And I think where the games versions of them succeeded is that like they leaned into the darkiness of Spider-Man that the movies didn't even necessarily get quite right.
Yeah, and to your point, I think if you wanted to do a legit choice-driven Spider-Man game, I think the interesting way to do that isn't like, you know, good, evil, black, white. It's like just let players make the choices that Peter makes all the time of like, oh, I told Mary Jane I'd go on a date with her and help her study or whatever, and she needs help or whatever. And then as I'm about to do that, crime happens, and you choose like, should I stay or should I go do that? And then also have her be pissed at me and you know, whatever consequences come of that. Or like, oh, I promised Aunt May I'd do something really important for her, but here comes Green Goblin blowing things up. What are you going to do? And then having to pick like you're in the same shoes as Peter of like, I'm sorry, Aunt May, I got to go make up some dumb excuse that I won't be able to really explain later. And then
honestly, if you want to do black and white moral choices, you make a Venom game. But this is just as much of a thing as far as choices go, and with nuance. You're absolutely right. Something that actually bugged me a little about the first Insomniac Spider-Man game was the fact that you could unlock everything. I kind of enjoy in games when you have a limited amount of capital, currency, whatever you want to call it, for unlocking, so that if there's a skill tree, you go for certain builds. You can't unlock everything. If there's costumes to unlock, you have to make those choices. Because I find that, for me, encourages replayability, because I'm going to try this version, I'm going to try that version. But also, for someone like Spider-Man, having everything feels antithetical to the character, which makes me feel really bad for Peter Parker, but is also part and parcel of the whole thing. And so, you're absolutely right, Marcus. The moral choices would not be good or evil. It would be Peter or Spider-Man. It would be the one or the many. It would be any of those things, and being the hero by choosing to face those consequences, whether it's J. Jonah Jameson lambasting what you did or didn't do, or the people in your life being disappointed by Peter letting them down again and having to live that.
And if in our fantasy world where this game has $1 bazillion behind it and they can do whatever they want, you almost do like a Baldur's Gate 3 level of like branching narrative of like, I missed work too many times because I was doing Spider-Man stuff. So now I am fired. And the story adjusts from there. I'm broke and I have to figure out how I am going to generate income while still being a superhero and then figuring that out.
And Peter's got enough skill and talent behind him and has had enough different jobs in comics and cartoons that you could actually kind of run through a bunch of them in that.
You just start Parker Industries in the game.
Right.
Yeah, you could do that, go back to, go be a science teacher, which is a stricter schedule, but steadier income, freelance photography. I don't know. How's Mary Jane doing? I'll be your photographer for a while, whatever it is. Like, that's another one, too, where Peter is both set in stone and yet not so set in stone as other comic book characters, where Clark Kent not working for the Daily Planet feels like something's very wrong. But if Peter's just kind of freelancing at the Bugle and then doing whatever else, that's Peter.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. We've fused a lot of praise, and before we get into the Insomniac trilogy, I do want to show a little bit of disappointment in this franchise as well, in this character and his games. There have been some incredibly terrible Spider-Man games, like other comic book characters as well. One of the ones that comes to the top of my list was a game I was excited for at the time. But do you guys remember when Spider-Man got his own Marvel Ultimate Alliance style game with only his villains?
Was that Friend or Foe?
That was Friend or Foe.
Oh, right. It had the kind of like stylized look to it.
So yeah, it was the stylized kind of
Yeah.
cartoony look. The voice acting was really good. And the funny thing was, all of the villains who had appeared in movies already were styled like those villains. Like Venom looked like the Spider-Man 3 Venom suit, but still buff like the comic book Venom. Sandman was actually, I believe, voiced by the same actor who played him in the movies. But like Green Goblin's design, Goblin 2, which was Harry's Goblin, had that design from Spider-Man 3. Like it was this weird mishmash. And like there are symbiotes taking over, but they're not from Venom. And like it was this weird attempt at trying to do X-Men Legends, but without any of those characters, just Spider-Man and his Rogues Gallery. And while I love Spider-Man's Rogues Gallery, and I agree, Geoff, I think it's better than Batman's Rogues Gallery, it did not make for a compelling video game. It was very bad.
Which is a real shame, because I would play a game that was a level from the perspective of just about any major and or minor member of Spider-Man's Rogues Gallery. I want to be the Shocker. I want to be the Rhino. I want to be Vulture. I want to be Sandman. Whatever. Infinite money video game, like, let me do a heist as each of them.
Payday with Spider-Man villains.
Yeah.
Just planning Sinister Six, working together.
And like, the point is you lose at the end of every boss battle.
It's like an asynchronous multiplayer game where you fight Spider-Man, but he's like insanely OP and he's incredibly hard to take down.
Exactly.
It turned Spider-Man into a Dark Souls boss.
Man, I forgot about Friend of Foe, and I didn't realize, I was looking it up now, that it came out the same year as Spider-Man 3 and the video game that came with it. So we got 2 Spider-Man games that year.
Yep.
Yeah, the early to mid aughts was definitely a time of, with the movies, with Ultimate Spider-Man, and with just general development continuing apace. There was a lot of different takes. And so you could kind of pick your favorite, and it's very easy for some to get swept under the rug, which is also why I think all of us have easy access to Spider-Man games to praise. And then like, well, what about that one? Don't worry about that one.
Well,
kind of feeling.
So here's a statistic that I hadn't realized until I was looking at the Wikipedia page that I shared with both of you. Since the year 2000, there's been a Spider-Man game every single year of some kind, until 2014's Amazing Spider-Man 2, which was a huge flop. And then it wasn't another 4 years until we got Insomniacs. That's wild to me. I can't think of another comic book franchise that had that many consistent releases. I mean, some of them were mobile games, and there were a couple of like DS or Game Boy games, but still, like that many consistent releases for so long, that's wild to me. It is not surprising to me that it slept for 4 years after Amazing Spider-Man 2, because it was not a good game, but like, it really is a franchise like any other video game franchise in a way that I hadn't quite realized till I looked at this list. I think now is a good time to move on to the Insomniac games, which are kind of what I would say 90% of our audience will have the most experience with, as they are lauded as some of the best video game experiences ever, as well as some of the best Spider-Man experiences ever. The trilogy of Marvel Spider-Man Miles Morales, and Marvel Spider-Man 2 are, I think, some of not only the best comic book storytelling in video games, but I think some of the best Spider-Man stories ever told. I think that the risks they take, I know that they consult with writers within Marvel as well, have helped write the games, but like has done some stuff that like even like we're not going to spoil Spider-Man 2 here. We're going to talk a little bit about the game, but like some of the turns that both Miles and Spider-Man 2 especially take with the characters to make them their own, make them unique and make them different really work, I think, better than some of the other adaptations we've seen.
Yeah. Again, not getting into spoiler territory, but it's like those games do a good job of like not necessarily changing the pieces, but like moving them around in interesting ways on the board that other adaptations have not done. Of like, what if this character had this ability that traditionally was someone else's thing? And you're like, oh, I never would have thought of that, but that's actually a really cool idea. And you pulled it off. I mean, going back to the writing, the biggest accomplishment of those games is making me fall in love with those characters all over again. Because it's like at this point in like probably all of our lives, it's like I've been married to this world for so long and I've seen so many iterations of Peter Parker and all of his buddies and enemies. And so, like, the longer you go, the harder it is to sort of like, okay, how's your Peter? How's your Peter going to stack up to maybe my favorite versions of him? And the writing in those games, especially the dialogue and, of course, the performances, too. It was like a reminder of why I fell in love with Spider-Man in the first place and, like, reinforcing that while also, like, adding some layers to them that made you appreciate them even more. Like, all three of those games, especially, like, the first one, it like made me cry.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I remember like not expecting that going in of like, I'm crying at this like AAA Spider-Man superhero game because holy crap, this got really emotional. Like this got real. Okay.
Yeah. Well, and I think some of it is, as we've sort of alluded to, there are certain bedrocks to the design of Spider-Man. And they're not what are typically your focal points or your anchor points for other superheroes. Yeah, it's his superpowers. Yeah, it's kind of his rogues gallery, but that's also, if you have a Batman game and there isn't the Joker, what are you even doing? There's at least 3 different villains that you could start off with for Spidey, and you could even pick some other ones and people aren't going to be too mad.
I mean, even the first game did that with like Mr. Negative of all people.
Right?
Being like the focal point. It was a more recent villain.
And they moved around enough things where it started off like, oh, there's Otto Octavius. Oh, I know how this is going to go. You do, but do you? Which I think we started getting from Ultimate Spider-Man back in 2000, not just the video game, but the comic series that for all of its boons and faults did an excellent job kind of shuffling things around where it all felt familiar and yet new, where it recontextualized, and I remember being super on board. That was the Ultimate series that I followed religiously and loved it. And even when my comic book nerd brain was like, that's not how I would do it, I still loved it. And it gave us Miles Morales, and it gave us a bigger world of what Spider-Man meant and who he could be. And those are the things that you hold on to in design. And that is what Insomniac Spider-Man has done. And it was definitely, to my knowledge, because I haven't played every Spider-Man game, the first ones since, like Spider-Man 2 on the PS2, Xbox, GameCube, and the like, that really gave us a balance of Spider-Man and Peter, or Spider-Man and Miles, as the case may be, where, yeah, you don't get to make the moral choices that we were talking about would be super fun, but you still got to see the effects of trying to balance that life. And however you want to play that out is one of the key points of Spider-Man. It's a power fantasy, but mired in reality. You know, as a New Yorker of many, many years and somebody who grew up just outside of it, getting to see it represented so well, even if they don't have my neighborhood in it, felt really good.
Yeah, I think the stories are incredible. I think the performances are incredible. I mean, I have to shout out Geoff and I's best friend and previous guest of this show, Yuri Lowenthal, because
Matt's the one who says this.
I always
look.
Wait, as long as you
Yuri's
say
a
friend of the
delightful,
show.
wonderful human. Absolutely.
I look until Yuri corrects me. He's our best friend. That's how I see it.
Yeah. I have that rule with Kenny Omega.
There you go. See,
Yeah.
you get it.
All right.
But in all seriousness, like Yuri's performance as Spider-Man, like which has now become iconic because he's gone on to voice him in Marvel Ultimate Alliance 3 and Marvel Midnight Suns. Like he's doing the Stephen Blum thing these days.
Oh, yeah.
There's something about his performance that just feels so much to the core. And when we interviewed him way back when, after the first game, like he said, he's a Spider-Man nerd. he loves the character as much as we do. And so it was so easy for him to find that voice because he just loves the character and like knows who Spider-Man is. And it is absolutely key in not only his performance, but all of the performances in these games. Like I think about the Norman Osborn performances in the 3 games. I think he's mostly in 1 and 3. There's something subtle about it. Like he's not the Willem Dafoe performance, which I love, but is a different kind of subtle key, and especially stuff in Spider-Man 2 when you're talking to him person to person in a way that he was kind of this almost like governmental villain in the first game, but he's more human in the third game for sure. I've never played another Spider-Man game where I care as much about the human characters as I do the superheroes, right? We complain about the Transformers movies. Nobody cares about the humans. We just want to see the giant robots, things like that. Same in like a lot of comic book stuff. But here, like, I love Rita Morales. I love Genki. I love like all of these characters are played so well, and it makes the world feel more lived in because all of these characters are just as well managed, made, and written as Spider-Man himself.
And you care about those that fall to villainy. You're just as upset as Peter is.
Yeah.
I mean, I certainly was.
Yeah. I think the benefit of like setting their Spider-Man as like an experienced Spider-Man that's been doing it for a decade. Like he knows what he's doing. A lot of his rogues gallery he's already got established, rivalries with. He's not meeting a lot of them for the first time. So you're kind of dropping in the middle of his life, sort of. I think helps because you can get past the sort of those initial introductions with most of them and then just sort of like build on them and make them more interesting. Because it's like, okay, like even they are like the villains themselves are season 2, you know? And then it makes it feel a little bit more impactful when you do introduce someone that he hasn't fought for the first time because he's coming at it from a lens of experience and not like naivete necessarily all the time. And I kind of like that for him of like, okay, like who's this Mr. Negative guy or like the stuff with Octavius and all that stuff. It's like, okay, like how does a mature Peter deal with something that traditionally we've seen him deal with when he was like still figuring it out? You know? Yeah. And kind of allowing him to still show that he's still learning, like he doesn't have everything figured out because how could you with that gig?
Absolutely. Well, and especially because Spider-Man was always the teen superhero, and getting to have a jaded 10 years on Spider-Man is still 25 years old. And all of us are enough past 25 on this show right now that I was talking about this yesterday, I think, where is that kind of like, yeah, no, I believe that there are 25-year-olds out there that are like, have been through it and everything else. But I remember it being 25 and oh my God. And I always love when people joke about, Rogues Gallery doing the math and figuring out, wait, you're how old? How long have we been fighting? I almost killed a child. I'm evil, but jeez. And yeah, I would say my biggest complaint about a show like Spectacular Spider-Man was they spent the whole first season making the villains every episode. And they did cool stuff and they had great performances, but it's Spider-Man. There are so many characters that you don't need to introduce Adrian Toomes. The Vulture is the Vulture. And you can learn during dialogue in the boss fight. That's fine. But there are other characters, and having that, you're right, Marcus, having that contrast is key. It makes it feel like a lived-in world.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's also like the fun of in Spider-Man 2, we know Kraven's the main villain as far as we know from the marketing and everything else. And like they made Kraven really intimidating in a way that like he was intimidating, I'd say, in the 90s cartoon. He was interesting in the 90s cartoon. That's probably the thing I remember him from the most besides this game. But like here, like they truly make him a scary individual in a way that I didn't think was possible, and yet still integrated him to the story and still find ways to humanize him in a way because his story is a tragic one like it was in the comics. And I think that's really brilliant. Venom is a character who we know is in this game, and I'm not going to spoil the who and the why, also is done in a way that I've never really seen before that I think works really well and still has surprises. I mean, there's a moment in the second game that I didn't know was coming that when it happened, I cackled. I literally cackled. And I don't want to ruin that for other people, but the fact that Insomniac can continue to do that 3 games later is astonishing. And even Miles Morales. Miles has become one of my favorite comic book characters of all time. He's just such a fun character, both in the movies and in the games. I love that we don't get Peter's origin in the first game because we've seen it 1,000 times. Please don't kill Uncle Ben again. But we do see Miles's origins, and we still get that story because his father dies, right? Like in the comics. And I guess a spoiler for a game that's been out for a while. Sorry, it happens in the comics too. But like having that kind of pain still, but in a different way, from a different light with a different kind of character. And then showing how these characters grow in the third game is really, really brilliant to me. And also the spin they put on a fairly well-known, I'd say B tier Spider-Man villain in Miles Morales was also brilliantly done. Like, I have no complaints about that because they took a character who is sort of known and made probably one of the most interesting versions of that villain. And I love that. And I like that Insomniac is doing that. But on the other hand, what Geoff is saying, like, we know where it's going with Otto Octavius. We don't know how, but we know where it's headed. And still, when it happened, everyone on this call cried when we got to that moment, right?
And they could fake you out 1,000 times with it, and you're still just...
Yeah, like they almost got to a point in that first game where you're like, are they going to do it?
Yeah.
Maybe not. And and like, to what you guys are saying, like, those games do a good job of not, like, putting the spotlight on the obvious villains of, like, they take a B tier villain and they build them up in a way. Like, they pick one, or like, hey, Mr. Negative has not really had a lot of mainstream appearances. You know, he's kind of like a guy that only Spider-Man comic fans know about. What if we make him one of the main villains? Because we have like a new sort of canvas to paint with him. They do such a good job with him, right? I was like, I like Mr. Negative. He's cool. But you know, he doesn't leap to my mind as like a top tier Spider-Man villain. But after what they like, the Insomniac version of him, it's like, oh yeah, he's interesting. He's really cool. I love how they tied him with Peter and all that stuff. And like I said, they did the same with Tinkerer and Miles Morales. And then especially with Kraven, who I'm with you, Matt, about like, yeah, Kraven's always been cool, but he's always been like B tier to me on the Spider-Man ladder, villain ladder.
He had Kraven's Last Hunt, and that's it.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, it's like there's been some cool stories here and there with him, but it's like, he's all right. To make him like legitimately scary and intimidating in the new game, we're like, oh man, like he's not... This guy's not messing around. Okay, I'm down with that. And then having the restraint to kind of play the long game with the like A tier villains, because it's like, okay, like the pieces are there, but we're not doing it yet. Of like, okay, Octavius is here, and they tease it so long, and you're again, they make you think like maybe we won't. Like so many other different things are happening. Maybe they go another way. And like Norman's probably the best example of that. Yeah. Like, every time you see him, you're like, is this it? Is this it? And you're just like more than any other character, honestly, it's like the stuff they do with him in 2 of like you mentioned, Matt, talking to him and just seeing how like human he is. And you're like, is this game gonna make me kind of like Norman Osborn? Because like as a Spider-Man fan, everyone agree, like you see Norman Osborn, your own spider sense goes off of like, stay away from that guy.
Yeah. Even if he's nice now, if he's not the Goblin yet.
Or if who knows if he becomes that, honestly.
Right.
He could, like, again, those games are so good at throwing curveballs, but they also don't feel like curveballs for the sake of curveballs. Like, they feel thought out. Like, this is not what I expected, but it makes sense based on, like, the story and the breadcrumbs you were telling, where it doesn't just feel like, haha, we tricked you because we could, I guess, you know?
Yeah.
Maybe the biggest thing with Spider-Man 2 specifically is this might be my favorite version of Harry Osborn.
100%. Absolutely.
I feel like Harry, especially in like adaptations, is very hit and miss on how he's portrayed. Like, as much as I love the 90s series, that Harry is so annoying.
Oh, so
he sucks so
insufferable.
bad in that show. He's just like the worst. And I like James Franco's Harry for the most part until Spider-Man 3.
There's a lot of things I liked until Spider-Man 3.
Yeah, until he was the dumbest person alive. And then again, it's like hit and miss. Like, there's something about that character that not everyone can kind of grasp, like what makes Harry interesting. And I feel like this game, the biggest accomplishment with Harry in this game is that because like every comic fan knows, Harry Osborn is not a character that gets happy endings. Bad things happen to Harry all the time in so many different ways. And having that knowledge going into the sequel and just kind of like wondering what it's going to be, and I'm not going to say what it is, but like, is it going to happen? But like dreading it in a way where like any other adaptation, you're like, oh, Harry's here. Well, let's start the countdown timer to when he becomes Green Goblin or whatever, dies, something bad's going to happen to him. And then like making him feel like such a likable person and his friendship with Peter feeling so genuine. And you're like, I was like actively rooting for them from the moment you go on that little bike ride, and their friendship feels real and believable, and you hang out with him and you're like, I think I really liked him. Like, not like in a real human way, to where it's like, if something bad's gonna happen to him, I don't know if I want to see that this time. I just kind of want him to be okay for once. And if you can make me actually like tense up and be like, please, can we leave Harry alone maybe this time? I think that's another sort of like feather in Insomniac's cap to make me genuinely give a crap about Harry Osborn in a way that I don't think I have in a while. You know?
Well, yeah, and I think also like Insomniac kept saying this Venom is not Eddie Brock and he's not who you think he is. To me, that made me question who I thought it was, and then even still being surprised when I found out who it was, right? The moment is still an impactful moment, that surprise. There's never a moment with Venom where you go, oh, well, here we go. I knew this was coming. Like, Venom's whole arc in the game is full of surprises, and I love that too, because that's a character who has been in the movies recently and has been done to death in some places, and they still find new things to do with that character too. I think that this second game leaves so many doors open for a third game, which I know we'll get eventually after Wolverine, that like I have no idea where they'll go. Like the first game and Miles Morales both ended in a way that we knew we were headed to the symbiote, right? Like it made it pretty obvious that that's where we were headed as part of the third game. The Kraven introduction was also a surprise. Nothing hinted at Kraven in the first two games. And so like, I love that Insomniac, even while digging through stuff that we are super familiar with, continue to surprise us, not just in the writing, not just in the structure, not just in the mechanics and the gameplay, but literally it's full of surprises in the same way. Like I like to say, I never see a twist coming. I play the Yakuza franchise, the Like a Dragon franchise, and every time there's a major twist, which there always is in every one of those games, I never see it coming. Completely blindsides me, and I love it. And it's the same thing with these Insomniac games. Like, even when you know where it's headed, they still find a way to make your jaw drop. And I love that. It's what makes these some of the best video games I think ever made, not just Spider-Man games.
Well, and Spider-Man's good for that kind of, I'm just going to say tragedy. That idea of those things where this could have been avoided. There's so many things in Peter's life, in Harry's life, in MJ's life, in all of the villains' lives. This could have been avoided. But it couldn't because of who they were and what they felt they needed to do. And so even if it's a so-called twist and you see it coming, it's all the more different but still good experience because you know it's inevitable. And it hurts. And God, I want to play those games again. I think I need to start from the first one. Oh my God.
I mean, for me, those games are also like amazing beacons of optimism.
Yes.
And like faith in humanity. Like just the positivity that like Peter and Miles radiate. And, you know, that's something that's central to their characters and always have been, of like Peter, you know, as many times as he gets knocked down and kicked when he's down, that he always finds a way to get back up and say a quip. Despite losing people that he loves throughout the decades, he somehow manages to not totally lose himself. Even when he's, you know, he gets in his dark places for a while, he always is pulled back out of it. And I think these games, especially in like the side missions and stuff, there's something about the way they show that optimism with Peter and Miles, especially Miles with the stuff of like how much he cares about his community and, you know, looking out for just like the little guy in a way that it doesn't come off as like forced or cheesy. It's just sort of like comforting. It really does for me sort of like remind you of like the overwhelming amount of good that people are capable of if they really want to be. And I think playing Spider-Man 2 was especially cathartic, especially with just so many mess up things happening in the world right now.
Yeah.
It didn't feel like an escape from that stuff. It just was like a reminder and reinforcing of like, no matter how messed up things are and how people can be, there are people that exist that are so far the opposite of like how good they are. It's just like a reminder to like always keep that in mind. Like, yes, people have the capacity to do horrible things, but people have the exact same amount of capacity to be such forces for good. And to have that game remind you of that and have you do acts that like, yeah, you could save the world from like these criminals, but maybe you're just going to help some like old man find his granddaughter.
Oh my God, that mission.
And just talk to him about life.
Oh my God. Like the Miles mission. And like, I have this Discord with a bunch of friends where I'm posting about the games we've been playing. And I said, who's cutting onions during this side mission? It's unfair, unacceptable. Like, yeah. I love Batman. I like Superman a lot. Wolverine's one of my favorite characters too, but I think there's something that resonates so much with Spider-Man based on what you're saying, Marcus, is like there's the everyman of it, but also the good at heart wanting to do good narrative that is inherent to Spider-Man and why Miles and Peter are such great heroes and great Spider-Men is that, right? It's why we see the cracks in Spider-Verse and other things with the Spider-Men who aren't quite like that, who do want to control. I think that ultimately these games are a reminder that there is hope, even when things seem hopeless. And there are moments, even in the second game, where it seems completely hopeless. And these two characters are still trying to find the silver lining and figure out what they're going to do, right? And there's always someone to pick the other character back up, right? Miles always has Peter's back and vice versa. I think that's really so inherent to the storytelling that makes these games such a huge success in a way that other games were good, but these are like the pinnacle of these games.
And a piece of who Spider-Man is choice. Choosing kindness, choosing heroism, choosing to face odds. Despite the fact that Spider-Man, no matter who's wearing the mask, has superpowers, is strong, is capable, often goes up against odds that are stronger than him, smarter than him, more numerous, more well-connected, more anything, whether in their civilian identity or as Spider-Man. But they choose to persevere and continue. There's the whole sequence in Spider-Man number 33 where he's pinned down and under the machinery and lifts that all up and everything else that is more than anything else as a character with flaws. Why certainly I feel safe saying a lot of us, go back to Spider-Man for that optimism, for that hope, for that choice in bravery.
Yeah. I mean, it was Spider-Man that taught me a long time ago of the lesson of like, if you can help, then you should.
Yeah.
Even if it's like something small, it's still better than nothing. Just find a way to just be helpful, basically. Like it's, kindness costs you nothing. Mm-hmm. And also just to try your best to see the good in people, even people that maybe on the paper seem like they don't deserve it.
Yeah.
Second chances are so important. And I think Spider-Man 2 in particular does a good job of handling those themes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Like those games, it's just because of that. They leave me in such a good mood. Yeah. On top of like the heartache and the crying from like the emotional stuff. But then you walk away just feeling so like uplifted and you're just like, yeah, like I can do that. Like you feel like empowered in a way. Like, yeah, I can wear the mask too, like in life,
Yeah. And also they're incredible games. I remember playing the first Insomniac Spider-Man for the first time and actively cackling like a madman when I was web slinging and traversing buildings. I hadn't even got to Wilson Fisk yet. I hadn't gotten anywhere near anything. And I just had sheer unbridled delight, the likes of which I have not had since the first time I played as Supersonic. It was supersonic levels of, this is what I can do? This is just the game? And it was a fun game. And then there's all those wonderful emotional connections. It's the whole package.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Typically during these retrospectives, we ask our guests and we also say ourselves what our favorite game is. And like, I feel like we have to exclude the Insomniac games only because this is not an objective opinion. They are the best made Spider-Man games ever made. The traversal, the combat, to feel like Spider-Man, they are the best. And like, if you want to choose it as your favorite, you can, but I feel like that's the obvious answer. For me, it's Ultimate Spider-Man, and I think it's because of all those things we said when we were talking about that game. I'm a Venom sicko. It let me play as Venom. It was one of the first times where we sidestepped the normal Spider-Man canon and gave us a different story. We showed the symbiote in a different way. We showed all these characters in a different way. And for me also, it took what Spider-Man 2 did with the traversal and just made it better. I didn't know at that time that we were going to get the Insomniac games, which perfected the traversal. We didn't even talk about the web wings, which like feels like cheating, but still like really cool. I still prefer to web swing to the web wings, but they are a cool mechanic and they are great for like, I'm in a hurry. I need to finish the side mission because I got to go to bed or I got to go to work. I'm going to fly there instead because it takes half the time. For me, there was something about the cartooniness of the Ultimate Spider-Man game, yet still has one of the best climaxes, I think, in a Spider-Man game that no other Spider-Man game has done. And I think it's just the precursor to what the epics that we get now and will always remain in the upper echelon. It kills me. I own a PS2, but I don't have a copy of that game. I really need to get one because it still to this day has just remained as one of my favorites.
I do have a lot of love for Ultimate Spider-Man, and I'm now realizing I don't think I have a copy, and I got to track that down. But I do have a copy of Spider-Man 2, and I think that's going to get my vote because it is an incredible game. It shifted paradigms in such great ways. And it gave us the greatest boss battle in all of video games in Mysterio.
That's true. That Mysterio boss battle is one of the
best. That Mysterio boss battle like, I sometimes just stop and marvel at its glory. And listeners, if you haven't experienced it for yourself, look it up. It's great.
Yeah.
You're going to love it.
Yeah. I will say, though, I do have residual trauma from my friends and I yelling at each other, "My balloon," because it was the worst side mission in the entire game.
Look, they can't all be gems, all right?
Just saying. Just saying.
I also have worked with children for so many years that, like, I think I'm a little numb to that, but you're not wrong.
I mean, if it makes you guys feel better, I do still have a copy of Ultimate Spider-Man.
Yeah, let's go.
Someone's got it. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus.
And I have my Spider-Man 2 somewhere. Yeah, I guess I got to go back to the Neversoft game. As much as I love Spider-Man 2 and what it did for web swinging and all that stuff, it's just like, that was the first game where, like, that was my favorite Spider-Man game until 2018 Insomniac Spider-Man game. Because what I love about it that the other, like, the movie-based games didn't do was just, like, because at the end of the day, those are retellings of the films. Yes, they have some extra stuff, but it is retelling a film that I saw that was probably better as a film. Whereas, like, Neversoft Spider-Man's like, hey, here's an original story. We're going to throw in all these characters. Like, it felt like you were playing an episode of the 90s cartoon that I hold so dear with all these characters that I love. And again, at the time, it just nailed damn near everything about, like, this is what I want from Spider-Man. I can swing, I can climb on walls, I can shoot web lines, I can do impact webs, and the creativity and the level design that, again, I'm only appreciating now that I'm revisiting it. You've seen Matt, like Kyle, who's never seen it, is just like, honestly, when you told me you were playing this, I thought it would just be a beat 'em up, and I'm, like, impressed for, like, they introduce, like, a new idea every level of, like, it's not just going around and beat up a bunch of guys. It's like, oh, you know, you're like defusing a bomb, or, you know, destroying these symbiote generators, or protecting Jonah from Scorpion. It's like they leaned into the license in a way where, like, they understood the assignment. We could just let you fight Venom, but what if we threw this other twist that draws on your Spider-Man fandom of, like, also having to save Mary Jane and protect her from, like, drowning in this tank, and adding, like, making, like, another mechanical layer on top of just, like, punching Venom in the face. So now it's, like, again, almost like an early version of, like, the choice of, like, yes, I have to save Mary Jane, but then fight Venom, and then, like, what do I prioritize here? And for its time, it was just so impressive. So that's the one that, like, it just made such an impression on me as a Spider-Man fan.
Well, I definitely need to go back and play some of the older Spider-Man titles, and I'll definitely go for the ones in my collection first, but I think I got to track that one down. I got to give goddamn, I got to give that another try.
Yeah,
it's been too long.
It's a good one. I had it when it came out. I don't anymore, but I'm so glad that you're replaying it over on Game Informer, because it's been fun to revisit it through the VODs and through your experience of knowledge and Kyle's experience of bewilderment, I think, are both equally entertaining. Obviously, we didn't cover everything that has to do with Spider-Man. There's so many Spider-Man games. We could probably do another one of these in, you know, a year or two and cover a ton of other stuff. But I think it is clear why this character has remained iconic and why Insomniac has been able to do what they do with this character in these games. Marcus, thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure having you. It's been a pleasure working with you over on the Game Informer side. Why don't you tell folks who might not know what you do and all the cool stuff that you're a part of, like, do the shilling, do the plug part. Tell folks where to find you online.
Yeah, I'm associate editor at Game Informer magazine, 30-year-old magazine. The biggest gaming magazine in the world is what we're known as. It says it on the website or the magazine somewhere. But yeah, I write for them. Like I mentioned, we stream every Friday, kind of like in charge of our Twitch channel and stuff. So I do our weekly replays series where we revisit an old game and either play a little bit of it, or, as we're doing out with Spider-Man, playing it from start to finish every week. But also co-host the Game Informer Show, our flagship podcast that Matt Storm does a great job editing for us.
Thank you. Checks in the mail.
And then also, like, just writing and video stuff. So be sure to subscribe to the magazine to check that out digitally and in stores at GameStop. You can also buy single issues of Game Informer for just $7.99 at your local GameStop. Catch up on all the awesome issues we've done this year. And you can follow me personally on Twitter and Blue Sky at Marcus Stewart 7.
Awesome. I will plug for Marcus. If you haven't gone to the Game Informer YouTube channel, you should go watch his most recent rapid fire Q&A with the devs of the new Avatar game. You've done a lot of funny rapid fires, but this might be one of the funniest ones you've done.
That was a great one. Yeah, me and Alex Van Aken, we wrote a lot of those questions together, and it was as much fun to put together as it was to shoot that. And thankfully, the devs at Massive were really good sports about it.
We love it.
And shout out to Charles Hart, who actually edited that video for us.
Hell yeah.
Nice.
And did a great job with it.
Yeah, I've slowly been collecting the Game Informer staff on side quests. So far, I think they've all aired. All of the ones that we've recorded so far for staffers have aired, and they've all been great, so you should check those out too.
Nice. Gathering us like Infinity Stones.
Exactly. Putting them in my glove.
Finally, I have them all. And then you snap and become editor?
I don't know. Yeah, I guess that's how, I don't know.
Matt erases all of us.
What is the goal on this one?
Takes over Game Informer.
I have too much work to do already. No, thank you. But yes, thank you for joining us, Marcus. This was a delight. We'll definitely have you back. Your Final Fantasy X side quest was great. Your little homage to the intro of the game with your intro was very clever. It was a fun little homage to that incredible game. Listeners, obviously we didn't talk about a Spider-Man game you love. It is statistically impossible for us to have covered them all. So tell us, what's your favorite Spider-Man game? Do you not like Spider-Man as a character? Is there a reason why? I mean, we all like and dislike stuff for all sorts of different reasons. If you have a favorite Spider-Man villain, who's that villain? What's the first Spider-Man game you ever played?
Have you ever completed the Quest Probe Spider-Man game? And why are you lying? Well, please tell me. What members of Spider-Man's Rogue Gallery or just cast of characters should be in the next video game? Who should Insomniac adapt? What are the great emotional moments that you've seen in Spider-Man games? What are the comic book storylines that you wish you could play through or experience for yourself through the medium of video games? We want to know all of this and so much more, and there's so many great ways to get in touch with us. You can find us across any social media we are a part of as of the recording of this episode, at funandgamespod. You can also email us at funandgamespod@gmail.com. Let us know what you thought of this episode, previous episodes, who you'd like us to talk with, and what you'd like us to talk about in future episodes. You can also visit our Patreon, patreon.com/funandgames, to just check out what we're up to. Anything that we're creating or putting together, we tend to put up there. You don't even have to subscribe as a paid patron to get that content, but we appreciate any and all that have the means to do so. And you might even find yourself up on the high scoreboard. And today's high scoreboard is Alex Lavelle, Case Aiken, Daniel Needon, Roger Reichardt, Alejandro Alves, Curly Bright, Film It Yourself, Patrick Edwards, Robert Proyne, and Sean Bowen. Thank you so much for your continued support. Please enter your initials in the form of pictures. Pictures of Spider-Man, and I want them on my desk by 3 o'clock at the end of the week.
Wow, that was really good.
Jeff's also a voice actor.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, right? There you go.
I'm like, whoa.
Well, at least now, if we ever want to do a bit with Jay Jonah, we have our Jay Jonah, that's for sure. Yes, please join the Patreon. There's a free tier. I've been writing articles there. I'm going to start writing more. Go check it out. You can follow along. You could also do a 7-day free trial of the top tier to listen to all of our bonus content in 7 days. It's a lot, but if you want to do it, you could do it that way too. And of course, rate and review the podcast when you have a chance. Go rate and review the Game Informer show. And then when you're done with that, go rate and review our podcast on Spotify, Apple, pretty much wherever you can rate and review podcasts. And also be sure to go to certainpov.com and check out not only this show, but other fantastic Certain POV podcasts. And you could even find a permanent invite link to our Discord server where we continue chats about what games we're playing over the weekend, new news, screenshots of games we're playing, a gaming log channel of games we've beaten and what we think of them. That's just the gaming channel. There's comic books, there's TV, there's music. There's so many things to talk about and so many great people to chat with about that. And really, this is where a lot of ideas for what we talk about come from and developments of what we like to talk about. And a lot of times, subjects we bring up and subjects we're going for, honestly, we love hearing from all of y'all about it because this is a conversation. Thank you for being a part of it. I'm Geoff Moonen. And I'm Matt A.K. Stormageddon.
And happy gaming.
So, I have a question. Have you ever wanted to get into comics, but you just didn't know where to start? Well, welcome to Comics Quest. I'm JD Martin, and every week I sit down with a guest to talk a comic that I think anybody can pick up and start their comics reading journey. We take a look at psychedelic sci-fi, fantastical action, heart-wrenching love stories, and of course, superheroes. So check us out at certainpov.com or wherever you listen to your podcasts.
CPOV. CertainPOV.com.